They say every family has its secrets, but some secrets are contracts written in blood and sealed with silence. The story you are about to hear is one of those. It's a testament to how a gilded cage can be the most brutal of prisons, and how the quietest betrayals can forge the strongest desire for revenge. This isn't just a story, it's a 40-year plan for justice. If you believe that payback is a dish best served cold, then follow my story to the very end. Please like, share, and subscribe, and make sure you hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss a single chapter in how an empire built on lies is brought crashing down to earth. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. I am an old woman now. My hands are spotted with the cartography of age, the skin thin as a moth's wing, stretched over knuckles that remember a lifetime of clenching. I live in a clean, quiet apartment where the Pacific Ocean breathes against the windows day and night. The air here is sharp with salt and clarity, a world away from the suffocating, cloying scent of pines that still chokes my memory of a place called Havenwood, Oregon. My grandson Leo sits across from me. He has his father's eyes, kind and earnest, but he has my stubborn jaw. He set up a small digital recorder on the glass table between us, its tiny red light a patient, blinking eye. He thinks he's here to document a simple family history, a sentimental tale of hardship and survival for some heartfelt journalistic piece. He thinks he's capturing the past. He doesn't know he's here to bear witness to a ghost. He doesn't know that I have summoned him here to be my weapon. My story, I tell him, my voice lower than he expects, doesn't begin with the day I was born. It doesn't start with childhood laughter or scraped knees. That girl, the one before, is a stranger to me. My story, the one that matters, begins with my death. It happened on a bright June afternoon, the day I married Richard Thorne, the day I ceased to be Abigail Miller and became a piece of Thorne property. I reach for an old faded photograph on the table. The corners are soft, the surface blurred by the touch of decades. I hold it up for him to see. It's a young woman, barely 20, her face a mask of forced radiance. Her smile is a masterpiece of deception, wide and bright, but so brittle it looks like it might crack the glossy paper. That's me. Next to me stands a man, handsome in that easy, thoughtless way some men are. His arm is around my waist, but his posture is loose, his gaze slightly distant, as if he's already looking past me to a crowd of admirers just out of frame. That was Richard. This, I tell Leo, and my voice is as steady as the sea outside, a calm surface over a dangerous depth. This is where the real contract was signed, not the one on paper that the justice of the peace witnessed. Not the one filed away in the county clerk's office. This picture marks the moment the true agreement was made, the one written in blood that was yet to be spilled, and sworn to, in a silence so profound, it would swallow my life for the next 20 years. Leo leans forward, his journalistic instincts piqued by the gravity in my tone. He sees a story, yes, but he still sees it as my story. He doesn't yet understand that it is his, too. The man in that picture, Richard, he wasn't always a ghost to me. When I first came to Havenwood, he felt like the sun. I arrived on a bus with one suitcase and a heart full of cautious hope. I was an orphan, aged out of a system that had provided shelter but no warmth, and Havenwood felt like a place plucked from a storybook. The trees were taller, the air cleaner, the sky a more perfect blue, and at the center of this perfect little world was the Thorne family. If Havenwood was a kingdom, Marcus Thorne was its undisputed king. And Richard, his only son, was Havenwood's golden son, the beloved prince. The Thornes didn't just live in the town, they were its circulatory system. They owned the lumber mill, the engine that powered the local economy, its rhythmic hum, the town's constant thrumming heartbeat. They owned the bank, where every family's savings and debts were held in their ledgers. They owned the choicest plots of land, the hardware store, the newspaper. The Thorne name was etched onto the brass plaque of the public library and carved into the cornerstone of the town hall. They were respected, yes, but it was more than that. It was a form of reverence, a deep and ingrained deference that bordered on fear. To cross a Thorne was to risk not just your job, but your place in the world. They were the arbiters of fortune in that small, isolated valley. I met Richard at a town picnic. He moved through the crowd with an effortless grace, a dazzling smile that seemed to include everyone in a private, wonderful joke. He was charming, attentive, and when his focus landed on me, it felt like being singled out by a spotlight. He made me feel seen in a way I never had before. For an orphan girl who felt perpetually invisible, that attention was a powerful intoxicant. But even then, in the first flush of that storybook romance, I sensed something else beneath the golden surface. There was a pliability to him, a subtle but constant deference to his father that I, in my naivety, mistook for filial piety, for good son devotion. I remember watching him once, laughing with his friends, and then his father, Marcus, would approach. The laughter would die in Richard's throat. His shoulders would subtly straighten, his easy smile tightening into something more formal, more performative. He would listen to his father with an unnerving stillness, nodding, always agreeing. His own light seemed to dim, his charisma becoming a borrowed, reflected glow from the sheer, oppressive power of the man beside him. Richard was a prince, but he was a prince who never dared to question the king. I didn't see it as weakness then, I saw it as stability. I was so young, so utterly alone, with no family to fall back on and no money to my name. Marrying Richard Thorne wasn't just an act of love, it felt like an act of profound, desperate salvation. He was offering me a name, a home, a future. He was offering me safety. Or so I thought. I was a drowning girl, and he was a beautiful, solid-looking ship on the horizon. I didn't understand that in a town like Havenwood, salvation always comes with a price tag. And I was about to learn that Marcus Thorne was the one who always came to collect the debt. Our wedding was the social event of the year in Havenwood. The entire town felt involved, their goodwill a warm blanket I wrapped myself in. I thought their smiles were for me, for us. I see now they were for the Thornes, a public display of loyalty to the crown. A few days after the ceremony, Marcus summoned us to his office at the mill. The room was like him, vast, dark, and imposing. It smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and money. A wall of windows overlooked the sprawling mill operation, a constant reminder of the source of his power. He sat behind a desk of polished mahogany so large it felt more like a monument than a piece of furniture. He gestured for us to sit in the two leather chairs facing him, which were positioned just low enough that we had to look up at him. It was a subtle, calculated detail. "A wedding gift," he announced, his voice a low, smooth rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. A benevolent smile played on his lips, but it never reached his eyes. His eyes were the color of cold steel, and they missed nothing. He slid a thick, creamy document across the polished surface of the desk. It stopped perfectly in front of Richard. "The old Miller cottage on Sparrow Lane," he said. "It stood empty for years. I've had my men renovate it completely, top to bottom, for you." I was stunned. The Miller cottage was one of the most beautiful homes in town, a historic house with a wraparound porch and a sprawling garden that backed onto the woods. It was far grander than anything a young couple just starting out, even a Thorne, could possibly afford. Richard beamed, his face alight with boyish gratitude. "Father, we don't know what to say. We can't accept this." "Nonsense." Marcus waved a dismissive hand, the large gold signet ring on his finger catching the light. "You're not accepting a gift. Consider it a long-term lease, to keep things official." He tapped the document. $1 a year. Just a formality to satisfy the lawyers. $1 a year. The generosity was staggering, designed to indebt us, to make us feel a sense of overwhelming obligation. It was the first link in the chain he was forging around me. Richard, eager to please, eager to show his appreciation, picked up the heavy, ornate fountain pen Marcus offered him. He didn't even glance at the pages of dense legal text. He just flipped to the last page and signed his name with a flourish. His signature was a testament to his trust, a blind faith in his father's benevolence. Then Marcus slid the document and the pen over to me. Abigail. My hand trembled slightly as I took the pen. It felt impossibly heavy. A wave of dizziness washed over me. For a fleeting second, a primal instinct screamed from some deep, forgotten part of my soul. A warning. Read it. Don't sign. But I looked at Richard, his face so full of happiness. I looked at the imposing figure of my new father-in-law, his smile waiting, patient. What could I do? To hesitate would be an insult. To question his generosity would be unthinkable. It would be a betrayal of Richard. I was an orphan who had just been handed a fairy tale life. Gratitude was my only acceptable response. So I did the same. I signed my name, my new name, Abigail Thorne, without reading a single word of the contract that was not a lease, but a deed of ownership, not for the house, for me. The house on Sparrow Lane was, on the surface, perfect. The renovations had been meticulous. The floors were gleaming hardwood, the walls were painted in soft, welcoming colors, and every room was filled with brand new furniture that was tasteful and expensive. The kitchen had the latest appliances. The bathrooms were tiled in cool marble. There was a rose garden in the back, meticulously pruned, and large windows that caught the morning light and made patterns on the floor. It was a dollhouse, a perfect, life-size dollhouse. But from the moment we moved in, it never felt like a home. The silence in that house was different from the peaceful quiet of my new apartment by the sea. It was a heavy, watchful silence. The air, even on the warmest days, was always cold, carrying a subterranean chill that no fire in the grand stone fireplace could ever seem to banish. Sounds were swallowed by the thick rugs and heavy drapes. My own footsteps seemed muffled, my voice too small for the high ceilings. Richard loved it, of course. He saw it as a symbol of his father's approval, a tangible measure of his own success. He'd walk through the rooms, running a hand over the smooth countertops, admiring the view from the bay window, his pride palpable. He didn't feel the cold. He didn't hear the silence. I tried. I baked bread to fill the kitchen with a warm, yeasty scent. I bought flowers to put in vases in every room. I played music on the radio. But it was like trying to fill a vacuum. The house simply absorbed my efforts, leaving behind that same sterile, chilling perfection. It didn't feel like a space we were living in. It felt like a space that was holding us. It was a perfectly decorated, beautifully appointed cage, and I was beginning to realize, with a slow, creeping horror, that the door hadn't been locked by me. It had been locked from the outside on the day I signed my name. Then, the landlord began to pay his visits. Marcus called them inspections. He was, after all, our landlord, on paper at least. The first few times, Richard was there. Marcus would arrive, unannounced, and Richard would greet him with that familiar, slightly tense eagerness to please. Marcus would walk through the house with the air of a monarch surveying his domain. He'd point out a fictional scuff on the baseboard or comment on the lawn, his observations all directed at Richard, who would nod seriously and promise to attend to it. During those visits, Marcus barely looked at me. I was just another piece of the house's decor. But then, the pattern shifted. Richard suddenly had a late meeting at the mill he couldn't get out of. Then a business trip to Portland was scheduled at the last minute. An important client was in town. His absences began to coincide, with unnerving precision, with the sound of Marcus's heavy, expensive car crunching on the gravel of our driveway. The visits grew longer. The pretense of inspecting the property grew thinner. Alone with me, Marcus's demeanor changed. He would walk through the rooms slowly, but his focus was no longer on the house. It was on me. He'd run a thick finger along a dusty mantelpiece, then look at me, a silent accusation. He'd stop in the middle of the living room, and his eyes, those cold, steel-gray eyes, would linger. It wasn't a lascivious gaze, not yet. It was something far more unnerving. It was the look of appraisal, the look of ownership. He would talk, his voice that same low rumble, but the words were layered, each one a stone dropped into the silent pool of my fear. "A fine property like this requires constant vigilance, Abigail," he'd say, trailing his hand over the back of the velvet sofa where I sat, frozen. "It must be kept in pristine condition. A tenant has duties, responsibilities." His language was a twisting maze of innuendo. He was talking about the house, but he was also talking about me. I was the tenant. I was the property. My duty was to be pristine, to be vigilant, to meet his unspoken standards. He was testing my boundaries, stepping a little closer each time, seeing how far he could push before I would flinch. He was teaching me the rules of our new arrangement, the real terms of the contract I had so foolishly signed. I felt a dread so profound it was physical. It was a coldness that settled deep in my bones, a feeling that had nothing to do with the relentless Oregon rain that beat against the windows. I started to feel like a specimen under a microscope. I would scrub the floors until my knuckles were raw, not out of a sense of housewifely pride, but out of a desperate, superstitious fear that a single speck of dust would give him an excuse, a reason to levy some unspoken punishment. I would hear his car, and my heart would seize in my chest. I'd smooth my dress, check my hair, my hands clammy, my breath short. I became a performer in my own home, playing the part of the gracious, subservient daughter-in-law, while every nerve screamed in protest. I would offer him coffee, my hands shaking so badly I was terrified I would spill it. He would accept, his eyes watching my every move, and he would sit in Richard's chair, the master of the house, while I perched on the edge of the sofa, feeling like an intruder. He was the landlord, and with every visit, with every layered comment and lingering look, he was making it terrifyingly clear that his ownership was not limited to the house on Sparrow Lane. He owned the land it sat on, the lumber it was built from, the son who lived within its walls, and now, he was asserting his claim over me too. I was just another one of his beautiful, valuable possessions, and he was just beginning to enjoy his new acquisition. The so-called inspections began to change. Their rhythm shifted from a predictable monthly intrusion to a creeping, unpredictable presence. Marcus no longer needed the pretense of a faulty faucet or a drafty window. He would appear at the door, a thin smile on his lips, his eyes sweeping past me to appraise the interior as if I were merely another fixture. He carried with him the heavy, cloying scent of expensive cologne and absolute power. His visits were always timed for Richard's absence, a fact that hung in the air between us, a silent acknowledgement of the theater he was orchestrating. At first, it was about pressure, a slow, methodical tightening of a screw. He would stand too close in the narrow hallway, forcing me to flatten myself against the wall to pass. His hand might brush my arm, a touch that lingered just a second too long, feigning paternal affection while his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a collector, a man assessing the value and condition of a prized acquisition. He spoke in a low murmur, a voice that never raised yet filled every corner of the house. His monologues were always the same, variations on a theme of gratitude and obligation. "A young woman like you," he'd say, trailing a finger along the polished surface of the dining table, "starting with nothing. And now, this. Havenwood is a town built on understanding, Abigail. People understand who provides for them. They understand their place." I would stand there, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white, my heart a frantic bird trapped in my ribs. I'd nod, murmur my thanks, anything to make him leave. But he savored the discomfort. He was a connoisseur of my fear. "Richard is a good boy," he continued one afternoon, blocking the doorway to the kitchen. "But he's soft. He doesn't understand the transactions that keep this world spinning. He sees the house, the car, the easy life. He doesn't see the price. But you do, don't you? You're smarter than him. You understand that nothing is free." The word he used was rent. It started as a joke, a cruel piece of wordplay. He would corner me in the living room, his bulk seeming to shrink the space around me, and he'd talk about the generosity of the $1 a year lease. "But of course," he'd say, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "there's the other rent, the real rent, the one paid in appreciation. In loyalty." The first time he collected it, the world went silent. All the small sounds of the house, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirp of a bird outside, they all vanished. There was only the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears and his low, steady voice. He didn't use force, not in the way one sees in cheap melodramas. There were no fists, no overt violence. His weapons were far more insidious, the crushing weight of his presence, the suffocating shame he radiated, the implicit threat of all he could take away. He trapped me against the wall, his body a cage of expensive wool and quiet menace. "It's time to collect the rent, Abigail," he murmured, his breath foul with the scent of coffee and self-satisfaction. He was a monster, but a meticulously organized one. A predator who had convinced himself he was merely a businessman conducting a necessary transaction. I felt my spirit disconnect from my body, floating somewhere near the ceiling, a silent, helpless observer to my own desecration. It was a violation so profound, so quiet. It felt like a dream. But the dream didn't end. As he finished, as he straightened his tie and smoothed his suit jacket, he leaned in and whispered the words that would become my mantra of madness. "This is part of the lease, Abigail. An unwritten clause." After he left, the silence was shattered by the sound of my own ragged gasps. I stumbled to the bathroom, my legs shaking, and turned on the shower, the water as hot as I could stand it. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw, red, and screaming, but I couldn't wash it off. I couldn't wash off the filth of his justification, the lingering stench of his so-called generosity. It was on me. It was in me. I was living in a waking nightmare, a horror story sanctioned and enabled by the very architecture of my life, by the foundation of my marriage, by my own husband's calculated and convenient absence. The house on Sparrow Lane was no longer just my home. It was the scene of the crime, and I was its only silent witness. Then came the sickness. At first, I blamed the stress, the constant gnawing anxiety that had become my baseline state of being. The morning nausea felt like a physical manifestation of my soul's revulsion. I would wake up, the ghost of Marcus's cologne still in my nostrils, and run to the bathroom, my body trying to expel a poison that wasn't in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. I was exhausted. I wasn't eating properly. My life was a suffocating loop of dread and performance. Of course my body would rebel. But the sickness didn't fade. It persisted, a grim, daily ritual. A quiet, terrifying thought began to take root in the back of my mind, a thought so monstrous I refused to give it light. But it grew anyway, in the dark, like a mold. One afternoon, after a particularly violent wave of nausea left me trembling and pale on the cool tile of the bathroom floor, I could no longer deny it. The dates, the timing, the missed cycle I had attributed to the turmoil of my life. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unwrap the small box I'd bought in a pharmacy in the next town over, my face hidden beneath a scarf and sunglasses like a common criminal. I waited, sitting on the edge of the tub, the pristine, sterile white of the bathroom feeling like a mockery. The two faint lines that appeared on the plastic stick weren't a confirmation of life. They were a death sentence. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me, so cold and vast it felt like drowning in an Arctic sea. I gasped for air, but my lungs filled with ice. I was pregnant. I scrambled for a piece of paper, a pen, my mind a chaotic storm of numbers and memories. I did the math. I did it again and again, my frantic scribbles a testament to my desperation. I counted the weeks, the days. I cross-referenced the calendar with the dates of Richard's business trips, the long, empty stretches when the house was mine and mine alone. And then I cross-referenced it with the dates of the inspections, the rent collections. The numbers didn't lie. They aligned with a horrifying mathematical certainty. It wasn't Richard's. The life growing inside of me, this tiny secret cluster of cells, was not a product of love or even of a lackluster marriage. It was a testament to my violation. It was the fruit of a poisonous tree. It was his, Marcus Thorne's. I dropped the pen and stumbled back, my hand flying to my stomach in a gesture of pure horror. I felt like a vessel for his venom, a living incubator for his legacy. He had not only defiled my home and my body, he had colonized my very biology. He had planted his flag within me. This secret in my blood was the ultimate proof of his ownership, an anchor that chained me to him in the most permanent, most grotesque way imaginable. The world outside the window, the manicured lawn, the cheerful chirping of sparrows, the placid blue sky, seemed like a painted backdrop for a play of unspeakable horror. The beautiful, perfect house on Sparrow Lane was no longer just a gilded cage. It had transformed. It was now a tomb, a sepulcher. And I was carrying the evidence of my own burial deep within me. I couldn't carry it alone anymore. The secret was a physical weight, a growing sickness that wasn't just in my stomach, but in my soul. It poisoned every thought, tainted every breath of air. For days I watched Richard move through the house, a ghost in his own life, and I saw him not as my husband, but as a stranger. He would talk about his day, about stock prices and quarterly reports, and I would nod, the chasm between his reality and mine so vast it felt like a physical canyon in the living room floor. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. It was raining, a relentless, miserable drizzle that blurred the windows and made the house feel even more like a prison. Richard was sitting in his armchair, reading the financial pages, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. The picture of domestic tranquility was so grotesquely false it made me want to scream. I stood in the doorway, watching him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a fist. The words were a physical pressure in my throat, a knot of razors I had to get out, or they would shred me from the inside. "Richard," I said. My voice was a croak. He looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes at being interrupted. "What is it, Abigail?" I couldn't stand there. I walked into the room, my legs feeling unsteady, and knelt on the floor in front of his chair. It wasn't a gesture of supplication, but of desperation. I needed to be close. I needed him to see me, to really see me. "I have to tell you something," I began, my voice trembling. And then it all came out. Not as a coherent narrative, but as a flood. A torrent of shame, fear, and violation that had been dammed up for months. I told him about the inspections, about the way his father's visits had changed. I told him about the low, menacing voice, the talk of rent and obligation. I cried, the tears I had swallowed for so long, finally breaking free, hot and bitter. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony that seemed to come from a place I didn't recognize. I didn't have to show him bruises on my skin, because there were none. The wounds were deeper. "Look at me," I pleaded, grabbing his hand, forcing him to meet my eyes. "I'm showing you the bruises on my soul." I told him everything, the unwritten clause, the violation, and then the final, terrible confession. "I'm pregnant, Richard," I choked out, the words feeling like poison on my tongue. "And it's not yours, it's his." The confession hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I stared at him, my tear-streaked face a mess of desperate hope. I expected something, anything. I expected rage, a roar of fury, a promise of vengeance. I expected him to leap to his feet, to smash his whiskey glass against the wall, to promise protection, to declare war on his own father for what he had done to me, to us. Instead, I saw fear. It was a quiet, chilling transformation. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, pale mask. His eyes, which had been locked on mine, slid away. They didn't look at me. They looked past me, at the expensive wallpaper, at the mahogany bookshelf, at the framed painting above the fireplace. He wasn't looking at his broken wife. He was looking at his assets. He was calculating the financial cost of my truth. A long, terrible silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of the rain and my own ragged breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper, thin and reedy, the voice of a coward. "We can't," he breathed, shaking his head slowly, still not looking at me. "Abigail, you don't understand. We have to be smart about this." "Smart?" I asked, my voice incredulous. "What does smart have to do with this?" "Everything," he hissed, finally looking at me, but his eyes were cold, distant. "He'll ruin us. He'll take everything. The house, the trust fund, my position at the firm. It will all be gone. He will crush us." In that single crystalline moment, I saw him. I saw him for what he truly was, stripped of the charm, the expensive suits, the veneer of a husband. He wasn't a man. He wasn't a partner. He was a shadow. His father's shadow, hollow and dependent, terrified of the powerful figure who cast it. He was choosing the inheritance over his wife. He was choosing the money over my soul. In the final, damning calculus of his fear, he chose his father. That was the betrayal that truly broke me. The violation at Marcus's hands had been an act of brutal, predatory power. It had wounded me, scarred me, trapped me. But this was different. This was the quiet, deliberate choice of the one person on earth who should have stood between me and the monster. He didn't just fail to protect me, he actively chose to sacrifice me on the altar of his own comfort and security. He looked at my profound, life-shattering pain and saw only a financial problem to be managed. He handed me back to his father, bound and gagged by his own silence. The cage door, which I had foolishly hoped he might open, was now locked, and he was standing with his father on the outside. I knew Richard must have told him. I knew it in the way he avoided my eyes for the next week, in the suffocating silence that filled the house, thicker and more menacing than ever before. He spoke to me only in curt, necessary sentences, his fear having curdled into a kind of resentful blame. He looked at me as if I were the source of the problem, as if my suffering were a contagion he was desperate to avoid. Exactly 1 week after my confession, it arrived. A crisp, cream-colored envelope, delivered by a courier, not the regular mailman. It felt heavy in my hand, unnaturally so, as if weighted with more than just paper. It bore the embossed letterhead of Thorne Industries, a logo I had come to associate with a specific corporate brand of evil. My name and address were typed with perfect, impersonal precision. It was not a letter of apology. It was not a summons for a family meeting. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, what it was. My hands trembled as I slid a letter opener under the seal, the slick slice of the paper sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. I pulled out a single, heavy sheet of paper. It was an eviction notice. It was formal, official, couched in the cold, detached language of law and business. It cited the lease agreement, the $1 a year contract I had signed with such naive gratitude on my wedding day. It referenced clauses and subclauses I had never bothered to read. I was to vacate the premises on Sparrow Lane within 30 days. The reason? Breach of contract. My eyes scanned the page, searching for the true cause, the real reason buried beneath the legalese. And then I found it. A single line, nestled in the middle of a dense paragraph. The line that burned itself into my memory, that seared my consciousness like a branding iron. The stated reason for the breach was this: violation of occupancy terms by housing an unauthorized tenant. I read the line again. And again. The words seemed to swim before my eyes, a cruel, nonsensical jumble of bureaucratic jargon. An unauthorized tenant? What were they talking about? I hadn't sublet a room. I hadn't taken in a boarder. And then the meaning crashed into me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. He wasn't talking about a subletter. He wasn't talking about a stranger. He was talking about my unborn child. His unborn child. His own grandchild. He was evicting me for being pregnant with the child he had forced upon me. He was using the language of property law to erase his own monstrous act, to reframe his crime as my contractual violation. The cruelty of it was so profound, so twisted, so elegantly monstrous, that it transcended simple evil. It was a masterpiece of malevolence. It was the act of a man so powerful, so insulated from consequence, that he could weaponize a lease agreement against the carrier of his own bloodline. It was insane. It was the bureaucratic paperwork of a psychopath. He wasn't just throwing me out. He was declaring the small, secret life inside of me to be an illegal occupant, a trespasser in a property he owned. It was the ultimate act of dehumanization. I was not a daughter-in-law, not a victim, not even a person. I was a faulty property, and he was exercising his legal right to have me removed. I sank to the floor, the eviction notice clutched in my hand, the paper crinkling in my white-knuckled grip. The house around me, with its perfect furnishings and silent, watchful rooms, suddenly felt like a stage set for a madman's play. He had given me the cage. He had violated me within it. He had planted his seed in me as proof of his conquest. And now he was throwing me out for bearing the evidence. It was a closed loop of such perfect, calculated cruelty, it left me breathless. In that moment, staring at the cold, typed words on the page, the last remnants of the young, hopeful girl who had come to Havenwood finally died. And in her place, something else, something cold and hard and patient, began to take root. That betrayal, Leo, was not a sudden crack in a foundation. It was the final, silent pull that unravels the entire tapestry. After Richard chose his inheritance over my humanity, There was nothing left of the girl who had arrived in Havenwood with foolish, hopeful dreams. The house on Sparrow Lane, once my gilded cage, now felt like a tomb waiting for a body, and Marcus Thorne had already sent the formal invitation. The eviction notice wasn't a surprise. It was a taunt. A final, cruel twist of the knife he'd been plunging into me for months. It arrived in a crisp, businesslike envelope delivered by a courier who wouldn't meet my eyes. The legal language was cold, precise, and utterly insane. Violation of residency terms, it stated, by means of harboring an unauthorized occupant. An unauthorized occupant. That's what he called his own grandchild. My child. A life he had forced into existence, now being used as the legal justification to cast me out. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was what finally severed the last thread of fear. Fear was a luxury I could no longer afford. It was replaced by something else, something cold and sharp and utterly clear. I didn't pack. What was there to take? The clothes were costumes for a role I no longer played. The furniture was just scenery for a horror show. Everything in that house was tainted by the Thorne name, by Marcus's phantom presence, and Richard's spineless absence. I left it all. I walked out the front door with my purse, the eviction notice folded neatly inside, my only souvenir from that life, and $23. I remember it exactly. $23 to erase a life, and, I hoped, to start a new one. I didn't look back. Looking back meant turning to salt, and I was determined to be forged into steel. The bus station was a gray, purgatorial space, smelling of diesel fumes and desperation. Each person there was either running from something or to something, and I was doing both. I bought a one-way ticket to a city I'd only ever seen on a map, a place so large I hoped I could become invisible within it. The journey was a blur of rain-streaked windows and anonymous towns that all looked a little like Havenwood, making my stomach clench each time we passed a manicured town square or a stately-looking bank. I didn't sleep. I just watched the yellow lines on the highway spool out behind us, a thread leading away from the labyrinth. With every mile, the monster at the center of it grew smaller, but I could still feel its breath on my neck. The city was a cacophony of noise and life that was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, no one was watching me. I was a ghost, a non-entity, and it was the safest I had ever felt. I found a room in a boarding house run by a weary-looking woman who asked no questions as long as the rent was paid in cash, on time. I got a job washing dishes in a greasy diner, the steam and the clatter of plates. A welcome shield for my thoughts. My hands were raw, my back ached, but the money I earned was mine. It was real. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't an allowance, and it certainly wasn't payment for services rendered in the dark. It was the foundation, the first stone. As my body changed, as the new life grew within me, a new kind of terror took root. This wasn't the fear of Marcus's footsteps in the hall. It was a deeper, more primal dread. What would happen when this child was born? Who would it look like? I prayed to a God I no longer believed in, begging that the child would be mine alone, a miracle of biology that would erase its father. The day Lily was born was the brightest and darkest day of my life. I was in a charity hospital, a place of echoing corridors and disinfectant, surrounded by strangers. The pain was all-consuming, a fire that I thought would burn me to ash. But then, it was over, and a nurse, with kind, tired eyes, placed a small, swaddled bundle in my arms. And I saw her. Lily. She was perfect. A tiny, flawless human being with a dusting of dark hair and a fierce, surprising grip on my finger. In that first moment, an impossible, tidal wave of love washed over me, so powerful it almost drowned me. It was a love so pure, so absolute it felt like it could heal everything. It could fill the hollow spaces inside me. It could build a fortress around us. It could protect us from the world. And then she opened her eyes, and I saw him. It wasn't overt. It was in the shape of her brow, the specific, unsettling shade of blue in her irises. It was a faint echo, a genetic whisper from the monster who had created her. And in that instant, the love didn't vanish, but it was joined by a cold, sickening horror. I saw her future laid out before me, I saw the shadow of the Thorne family stretching across the continent to find her. Marcus would never let a piece of his property go. He would see her as an extension of himself, another asset, another life to control. And Richard would do nothing. He would let it happen. She would grow up under that same suffocating weight, her life defined by their name, her spirit crushed by their legacy of poison. Protecting her wasn't about building a fortress around us. It was about getting her as far away from me, the link to that poison, as possible. The love I felt for her demanded the greatest sacrifice. It demanded that I cut her out of my life like a surgeon removing a cancerous tumor to save the patient. The decision hollowed me out. It felt like I was ripping out my own heart and offering it up on an altar. I spent 2 days in that hospital bed, holding her, memorizing every line of her face, every tiny sound she made. I sang her lullabies I didn't know I knew. I told her the story of a brave girl who would grow up in a happy home, with parents who loved her, a life free from shadows. I was writing a fairy tale for her that I would never get to read. Walking into the adoption agency was like walking to my own execution. The social worker was a gentle woman who saw my grief and mistook it for the usual regret. She spoke of options, of support systems. I just shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. I couldn't tell her the real reason. I couldn't say, I'm giving her away because her grandfather is a monster and her father is a coward and their sickness is in her blood. So I gave them a simpler story, a young, destitute woman who couldn't provide. It was a truth, just not the whole truth. Signing the papers felt like a perverse echo of signing that rental agreement with Marcus. Another contract, another signature that determined the course of a life. But this time, I wasn't the victim. I was the one making the choice. It was an act of brutal, agonizing love. The ink from the pen felt like it was bleeding directly from my veins. When I walked out of that agency, the world seemed to have lost its color. I was an empty vessel, a shell. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. But as I walked through the anonymous city streets, something else began to stir in that vast, empty space inside me. The grief was so immense, so absolute, that it burned away everything else. It burned away the last vestiges of the frightened girl from Havenwood. It burned away the victim, and in the ashes, something new began to calcify. It was resolve, cold, hard, and unbending. I had given up my daughter to save her from the thorns. Now, my life had only one remaining purpose. I would not just survive. I would not just build a new life. I would build an empire. I would gather wealth and influence not for their own sake, but as weapons. I would spend the rest of my days sharpening myself into a blade fine enough to sever the entire Thorne dynasty from its roots. I had paid the ultimate price. One day, I would return to Havenwood, and I would be the one to collect the debt. Marcus Thorne thought he was the landlord. He had no idea he was about to be foreclosed on. The years that followed were a long, slow, patient grind. There was no glamour in it. Leo. Just work. I took on a new name, a new history. I finished my education at night, sitting in lecture halls with students a decade younger than me, my focus so intense it was a physical force. While they were worrying about dates and parties, I was dissecting financial statements and legal theory. Every textbook was a whetstone. Every exam was a training exercise. My grief was the fuel, a constant low-burning fire that kept me going when exhaustion screamed for me to quit. I started small. I saved every dollar from a series of progressively better jobs, waitress, then bookkeeper, then office manager. I lived in tiny apartments, my only luxury the books I bought and the silence I cherished. That silence was my sanctuary. In Havenwood, silence had been a threat, the space where Marcus's footsteps could echo. Now, it was the fertile ground where my plans could grow. My first investment was terrifying. It was a few $100s, my entire savings, put into a small, overlooked tech stock that my research told me was undervalued. I watched it every day, my heart pounding with every tick up or down. When I sold it 6 months later for a modest profit, the feeling was intoxicating. It wasn't about the money, it was about the control. I had taken a risk based on my own intellect, my own judgment, And I had won. It was a small victory, but it was mine. From there, I grew bolder. I learned the language of the market, the ebb and flow of capital. I developed an instinct, a sixth sense for where value was hidden, where weakness could be exploited. I saw the entire financial world as a complex ecosystem, and I taught myself to be its apex predator. I moved from stocks to real estate, buying rundown properties in neglected neighborhoods and slowly, meticulously bringing them back to life. I wasn't just building a portfolio, I was practicing. I was learning how to identify rot, how to tear it down to the studs, and how to rebuild something strong and clean in its place. Every renovated building was a rehearsal for what I planned to do to the House of Thorne. Decades passed like this, a slow, silent accumulation of power. On the surface, I was a respectable, if intensely private, businesswoman. No one knew my history. No one knew the rage that powered my ambition. I kept the memory of Havenwood locked away in a vault in my mind, a place I visited only when the fire of my resolve needed stoking. During all this time, I kept a line open to the past, not directly. That would have been reckless. I hired a private investigator, a retired silver-haired gentleman named Mr. Allister, who specialized in discreet, long-term corporate and familial surveillance. I was just another wealthy client to him, wanting to keep an eye on a business rival. He never knew the truth. For 20 years, he sent me a report on the first of every month, a simple manila envelope with no return address. Those reports were my lifeline and my poison. They detailed the Thornes' lives in excruciating, mundane detail. Richard's predictable rise through the company ranks, his marriage to a socially acceptable woman, the birth of his 2 sons, and Marcus, who seemed ageless, untouchable, his power only growing as he aged. He was a pillar of the community, a celebrated philanthropist, his name etched onto university buildings and hospital wings. Every award he received, every fawning newspaper article, was like a fresh application of salt to my oldest wound. Then, one year, Mr. Allister's report contained something different. It was an addendum, filed under personal habits and idiosyncrasies. He noted that Marcus Thorne, a man of immense public wealth, had a peculiar, almost obsessive private ritual. He spent several hours every Sunday, alone in his locked study, with a collection of leather-bound books. They weren't company ledgers. The official finances were all handled by his accountants. These were personal. Mr. Allister, through a source on the housekeeping staff, learned that Marcus referred to them as his gardening books. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. A gardener, of course, that's how he saw himself. Tending to his prized specimens, pruning away the undesirable. Mr. Allister wrote, "He appears to be documenting something. The entries are made in a highly stylized coded script. My source says the books are organized by year and are his most prized possessions. He seems to derive a kind of satisfaction from them. Calls it keeping the accounts in order." Keeping the accounts in order. My blood ran cold. I knew, with a certainty that resonated in my very bones, what was in those books. It wasn't just about money. It was a record of his dominion, a catalog of the lives he had controlled, the careers he had shattered, the people he had broken. He wasn't just a monster. He was a meticulous archivist of his own monstrosities. He was the gardener, and we, the women he'd violated, the rivals he'd crushed, we were the specimens, pressed and labeled between the pages. I knew Leo. I knew that somewhere in a book dated from my time in Havenwood, there was a page with my name on it. Or perhaps not my name. Perhaps I was just the tenant Sparrow Lane. A brief coded entry detailing his conquest, his victory, his sick version of collecting the rent. That ledger, it became my obsession. It wasn't just evidence of a crime he would deny, and his wealth would absolve him of. It was more than that. It was the symbol of his soul. It was the physical manifestation of his sickness, the proof that his public benevolence was a mask for a private, predatory God complex. A man like Marcus Thorne wasn't afraid of losing money. He could always make more. He was afraid of being seen, truly seen. He was afraid of having his meticulously cultivated garden exposed for the toxic waste dump it truly was. I gave Mr. Allister new instructions. The focus was no longer on the family's public life or their finances. The mission was singular. Learn everything about those ledgers. Their location, their security, the nature of the code. It took years. It cost a small fortune. But bit by bit, he pieced it together. The ledgers were kept in a custom-built safe, hidden behind a false wall in his study. The code was a complex cipher of his own invention, mixing financial shorthand with obscure botanical terms. It was his masterpiece, his life's work, and I knew it would be the instrument of his destruction. I didn't want to just take his money or his company. That was too simple, too clean. I wanted to take his legacy. I wanted to take the very thing he cherished most, his secret, godlike record of his power, and use it to burn his entire world to the ground. I would turn his private sanctuary into a public spectacle. I would make his Garden of Secrets the headline of every newspaper. The ledgers were the key, and I would spend whatever time and money it took to find a way to turn that key. Life, however, has a way of moving forward, even when you're anchored to the past. In the midst of building my arsenal, something unexpected happened. I met a man, Arthur. He was an architect, a kind, quiet man with gentle eyes and a laugh that made me feel warm. It was a sensation I had forgotten existed. He wasn't powerful or wealthy. He was just decent. He saw the walls I had built around myself, and instead of trying to tear them down, he simply planted a garden at their base and waited. For the first time since leaving Havenwood, I allowed myself a sliver of happiness. We married. We had a son, David, and for a while, I lived a double life. I was a loving wife and mother, and I was a silent, patient hunter, gathering my weapons in the shadows. Arthur knew I was a shrewd businesswoman, but he never knew the depths of the darkness that drove me. I couldn't let him in. That part of me was a toxic, radioactive core, and I loved him too much to expose him to it. He deserved the peace he had given me. Arthur passed away a few years ago. He lived a good, full life, and he gave me a gift I never thought I'd have. A family, a real one. His legacy is our son, David, and David's legacy, well, his legacy is you, Leo. And that brings us to now, to this room, to why I finally decided to break a silence I have kept for nearly 50 years. You see, you are a journalist. I've read your work. You have a fire in you, a hunger for the truth that isn't just about ambition, it's about justice. You have a strength, a clarity of purpose that your grandfather Richard never possessed. You are the perfect instrument, forged from the best parts of my new life, yet untainted by the poison of my old one. So when I look at you, I don't just see my grandson. I see the final piece of a puzzle I have been assembling for a lifetime. This isn't a confession, Leo. This isn't a frail old woman unburdening herself. I am a client, and I am laying out a case. I have given you the facts, the timelines, the psychological profiles of the key players. I have spent decades building the financial leverage, the secret arsenal that we will need. I have the ammunition, but I need a soldier to fire the gun. I'm not asking for your pity. I am not interested in your sympathy. Pity is what they give to victims, and I stopped being a victim the day I walked out of that house on Sparrow Lane. I am giving you a purpose. I am giving you the story of a lifetime, but it comes with a condition. You won't just report it. You will become part of it. You will be the public face of my private war. You don't know it yet, sitting there with that look of shock and confusion on your face. You think you're just hearing a tragic family story, but you're not. You are being handed a weapon, sharp and heavy and ready to be used. You are about to become the author of the final, damning chapter of the Thorne family's celebrated legacy. And together, we are going to write an ending they never, ever saw coming. My revenge did not arrive like a thunderclap. It was a fog, rolling in silently from the sea, creeping into every foundation, every boardroom, every private ledger of the Thorne empire. With Leo by my side, I began the siege. He was the brilliant tactician, the public face I could never be, but I was the architect, the ghost with the blueprint for their ruin. The first phase was silent, fought not with words, but with numbers on a screen. "They're over-leveraged, Abigail," Leo had said, his face illuminated by the glow of a half-dozen financial reports spread across my dining room table. The city lights twinkled outside my window, a galaxy of distant fires. Dangerously so. Your husband, your ex-husband, He runs the financial wing like a gambler on a hot streak, but the streak is about to end. He's been using short-term, high-interest loans to cover long-term capital projects. It's a house of cards. A house of cards. The irony was so thick I could taste it. "And Marcus?" I asked, my voice steady. "He allows this?" "Marcus is the face, the brand. He's too busy collecting lifetime achievement awards and basking in the glow of his own mythology to notice the rot in the foundations. He trusts Richard implicitly. Of course he did. He trusted Richard to be weak. He trusted Richard to fail, eventually, just as he trusted him to stay silent all those years ago. Then we become the bank," I said. It wasn't a question. It became our ritual. Late nights fueled by black coffee and a cold, burning purpose. We created a web of shell corporations, each one a phantom entity registered in distant, anonymous jurisdictions. I gave them names that were my own private, bitter jokes. Sparrow Lane Holdings, Unwritten Clause Capital, Eviction Notice Investments. Through these we began to buy up their debt. A loan from a regional bank here, a block of commercial paper there. It was slow, meticulous work, like needlepoint. Each purchase was a single stitch in a vast, dark tapestry. I never saw their names on the initial paperwork, only the names of the lending institutions, but I knew. With every transaction I felt the threads pulling tighter, my invisible hands closing around the throat of their legacy. I was becoming their primary creditor, their silent, unknown landlord, and they had no idea. While Leo navigated the labyrinthine world of high finance, I tasked him with another, more personal mission. "I need a private investigator, Leo. The best you can find. Discreet." He looked at me, his journalistic instincts flaring. "For what?" "For loose ends," I said. "For ghosts." I gave the investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Mr. Alastair, 3 names. They were names I had overheard in the market, names whispered by maids when they thought I wasn't listening, names of young women who had worked for a time at the Thorne mill or in one of their offices, and then just disappeared from Havenwood. They had families, histories. I provided the scant details I remembered. A mention of a family in a neighboring state, a rumor of a cousin in the city. It was little more than smoke, but Mr. Alastair was an expert at finding fire. Weeks turned into a month. The financial siege continued, our position strengthening with each passing day. Then, a package arrived. A thick, plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside were 3 smaller envelopes. Each contained a story, meticulously documented. Police reports of sudden departures, letters to family that abruptly stopped, financial records showing a one-time, significant severance package from a Thorne subsidiary, paid out just before the woman vanished from local life. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same, a quiet, systematic erasure. Mr. Alastair had also included current addresses. 2 of the women were alive, living quiet, diminished lives in other towns, their shame and fear still a palpable shadow over them. One had passed away years ago. Reading their stories was like looking into a distorted mirror. I saw my own pain reflected in their fragmented histories. I was not the only one. I had always known that intellectually, but to see the proof, to hold the cold, hard facts in my hands, it was validating and horrifying. Marcus hadn't just built a business empire. He had curated a secret garden of broken lives. These files were not just evidence. They were testimonies. But there was a 4th envelope at the bottom of the package, one I hadn't expected. It was thinner, containing only a single sheet of paper and a photograph. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The name on the paper was Lily Morrison, my Lily. The report was brief. She was a history professor at a university a few states away, married, 2 children, a boy and a girl. The photograph showed her on a campus green, laughing, her arm around a kind-faced man. Her children were chasing a ball on the grass behind them. She had my eyes. The same shape, the same deep, searching quality. But hers were not haunted. They were bright, full of life, and a peace I had never known. She was beautiful. She was whole. She was safe. I sank into my chair, the photograph pressed to my chest. The cold fire of my rage, the thing that had sustained me for decades, suddenly felt different. It was no longer just about vengeance. It was about protection. The world she lived in, the life she had built, was predicated on the fact that she was beyond the reach of the Thorne family's poison. I had given her up to keep her from them, and in doing so, I had given her a chance at this laughter, this ordinary, beautiful happiness. That photograph became my sanctuary and my sword. Every time my resolve wavered, every time the sheer scale of my undertaking felt overwhelming, I would look at her face. I wasn't just tearing down an empire of corruption. I was building a firewall around my daughter's world. I was ensuring that the name Thorne would never, ever be anything more than a footnote in a history book she might one day teach. The knowledge that she was safe, that she was thriving, was not a balm to soothe my pain. It was the fuel for the final, decisive push. The fog was about to become a storm. The Havenwood Founders' Day Gala was the jewel in the town's social crown, a night of performative humility and ostentatious self-congratulation. The entire town, or at least the parts of it that mattered to the Thornes, was there. I watched it all, not from inside the grand ballroom of the Havenwood Country Club, but from the live stream Leo had set up on his laptop in my apartment. I saw the crystal chandeliers, the cascades of white roses, the uniformed waiters gliding through the crowd with trays of champagne. I saw the faces of people I had once known, their features softened by age and success, their consciences scrubbed clean by decades of willful ignorance. And then I saw him. Marcus Thorne. He was stooped now, his imposing frame slightly bent by the weight of his 80-odd years, but the arrogance was still there, undiminished. It radiated from him like a toxic heat, a core of unshakable self-importance. He was on stage, bathed in a warm, forgiving spotlight, preparing to accept the mayor's Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to the community. The hypocrisy was a physical force, so breathtaking it felt like the air was being sucked out of my own living room, thousands of miles away. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing slightly. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice a gravelly, practiced baritone. It was the same voice that had whispered poison in my ear in the dark. When my father founded Thorne Industries, he didn't just want to build a business. He wanted to build a community, a legacy. He spoke of integrity, of hard work, of family values. He spoke of Havenwood as a garden he had tended, a place where good people could flourish under his benevolent watch. With every word, a cold, precise rage solidified within me. He was not just a monster, he was a master narrator, and for his entire life, he had controlled the story. Tonight, the story was going to change. "We are all custodians of that legacy," he was saying, his hand sweeping out to encompass the adoring crowd. "It is our duty to protect it, to nurture it, to pass it on to our children and our children's children, stronger and more vibrant than we found it." It was then that I saw the movement. In the middle of his sanctimonious speech, a figure detached from the shadows at the side of the room. A young man, in a perfectly tailored, sharp suit, walking with a calm, deliberate purpose directly towards the stage. It was Leo. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not part of the program. Security guards shifted, uncertain. Marcus paused, his folksy smile tightening at the edges with annoyance. He squinted at the approaching figure. Leo didn't rush. He didn't shout. He ascended the small set of stairs to the stage as if he had been invited. He was not there to make a scene, not in the traditional sense. He was there to deliver a message. He walked straight to the podium and stopped in front of Marcus Thorne. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The entire ballroom held its breath. Then Leo simply held out a handsome, leather-bound portfolio. It looked official, important. A gift, perhaps. A surprise tribute? Marcus, confused but regaining his composure, reached out and took it. His expression was one of paternal condescension, as if indulging a foolish but well-meaning young man. He opened the portfolio. From my screen, I couldn't see the documents inside, but I didn't need to. I knew every word on every page. I had read them 100 times. They were the foreclosure notices, the cold black and white legal instruments that transferred ownership. I saw the change on Marcus's face. The confusion curdled into disbelief, then into a dawning, sickening horror. His face, a mask of public virtue moments before, seemed to collapse inward. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. His hand, the one holding the portfolio, began to tremble. He was reading the final testament of his life, but he wasn't the author. I was. The papers told him, in the merciless language of finance and law, that I owned his mill, the bedrock of his family's fortune. I owned his controlling shares in the local bank, the institution he used to control the town's commerce. I owned the development properties he was so proud of. I owned the very land his ostentatious mansion was built on. I owned him. His garden of thorns had been repossessed. As Marcus stood there, paralyzed, a new sound began to ripple through the ballroom. It started as a single, isolated buzz, then another and another, until it became a chorus, a digital swarm. Every phone in the room, held in the hands of Havenwood's elite, was vibrating, lighting up with a notification. On my own screen, a new window popped open, sent by Leo. It was the article, published just seconds before by a national investigative news outlet, attributed to an anonymous source. Leo's name was on the byline as the reporter. The headline was simple, devastating. The Landlord of Havenwood and the Unspoken Clause. The story began. It didn't use my name. It didn't need to. It told the tale of a young orphaned woman who married into a powerful family. It described a beautiful house on Sparrow Lane, a wedding gift with a symbolic rent of $1 a year. It detailed a landlord's visits, the creeping dread, the violation that was called collecting the rent. And then, the ultimate cruelty, an eviction notice, served to a terrified, pregnant young woman for the crime of harboring an unauthorized tenant, the landlord's own unborn child. The narrative was tight, dispassionate, and all the more powerful for it. But it wasn't just my story. Woven into the article was the corroborating anonymous testimony of two other women. One spoke of a severance package and a threat against her family that forced her out of town. The other spoke of a similar abuse of power, of being cornered in an empty office after hours. Their stories, though details differed, echoed the same chilling theme of entitlement and predation. And then came the final, brutal stroke. The article included a high-resolution image of a single decoded page from Marcus's infamous ledgers. It wasn't my page. To use my own would have felt like a violation, a reopening of a wound I had fought so hard to close. Instead, Leo and I had chosen the page of one of the other victims, a woman who had given us her blessing to use it, as long as her name remained hidden. The coded entry was there, with the decoded text beneath it. Asset acquired, terms fulfilled, account closed. It was the language of a sociopath, a businessman cataloging the souls he had consumed. It was undeniable proof that the ledgers existed. In the ballroom, the silence of shock had been replaced by a rising tide of frantic, horrified whispers. People were staring at their phones, then up at the stage, at the old man who was now clutching the podium for support. His empire had been built on two pillars, his wealth and his reputation. In the space of 5 minutes, I had demolished both. His money was mine. His name was mud. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the screens illuminating my face. I didn't need a courtroom. I didn't need a judge or a jury. I had learned the lessons of power from the master himself. I had become the bank. I had become the press. I had written a new contract, a final contract, and its terms were unconditional surrender. A week passed. A week in which the Thorne name was systematically dismantled in the court of public opinion. Partners pulled out of deals. The bank shares I hadn't already acquired plummeted. The town that had once revered them now shunned them. Marcus was a recluse, a ghost haunting a house that now legally belonged to a numbered company I controlled. Then, one evening, my doorman buzzed. "Ma'am, there's a Mr. Richard Thorne here to see you." I felt a tremor, not of fear, but of finality. "Send him up." When I opened the door, I saw a man I barely recognized. The years had not been kind, but the last week had been brutal. He looked old, his shoulders slumped in a permanent posture of defeat. The expensive suit he wore seemed to hang off him, a costume for a part he could no longer play. He stepped inside my apartment, his eyes scanning the space. It was clean, modern, filled with books and art, and overlooking the endless expanse of the ocean. It was the antithesis of the house on Sparrow Lane. It was mine. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. The fire in him, if it ever truly existed, had long since been extinguished. He just stood in the center of my living room, looking utterly lost. "Abigail," he began, his voice raspy. "Please, stop this." I said nothing. I simply walked over to the window and looked out at the darkening water. He took a hesitant step closer. "It's enough. You've won. You've taken the money. You've ruined my father. What more do you want?" He was begging. Not for me, not for what had been done to me. He was begging for the illusion. "Please, Abigail," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Think of the name, the family name. Think of what people will say." And there it was. After all these decades, after everything, he still didn't understand. He wasn't mourning a father's honor or a family's legacy. He was mourning the facade, the pristine, public-facing lie that had allowed him to live his comfortable, cowardly life. He was worried about the drapes, not the rot in the walls. I turned from the window and looked at him. I looked at this man I had once loved with all the hope of a naive young girl. This man who held the key to my cage and had refused to turn it. This hollowed-out shell of a person, defined only by the name he bore. And I felt nothing. It was the most profound and peaceful emptiness I had ever known. Not a flicker of hatred, not a spark of pity, just a vast, quiet void. The space where my love for him used to be was now a vacuum. He searched my face, desperate for a reaction, an argument, a negotiation, anything. I gave him nothing. I just stared at him, my expression placid, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I let the silence stretch, letting it fill the room, letting it press down on him. I wanted him to feel the weight of it, the suffocating pressure of a presence that refuses to acknowledge you. I was giving him the exact same thing he had given me in that cold, sterile living room all those years ago, when I had confessed my shame and terror and he had looked away. I was giving him the gift of absolute, profound nothingness. His face crumpled. The last vestige of his composure broke. He understood, finally, that there was no bargain to be made here. He was irrelevant, a ghost from a past I had now fully exorcised. He turned, without another word, and walked out of my apartment, closing the door softly behind him. His punishment was not ruin. His father had ruin. His punishment was to be erased from my story, to fade into the irrelevance he had chosen for himself. And that, I say, my voice quiet in the still air of the room, is the end of the story. Leo is looking at me. He has sat, utterly silent, for hours, listening. His reporter's notebook lies forgotten on the table beside him. His eyes, so sharp and intelligent, are wide now with a terrible, complete understanding. He hasn't just heard a story, he has witnessed a life. The Thornes are a local disgrace, I continue, turning my gaze back to the ocean outside my window. The sun is setting, painting the water in strokes of orange and violet. Marcus lives in that house, a prisoner of his own infamy. The bank foreclosed, but I allow him to stay. A final, small cruelty. He is a ghost in a house that is no longer his. Richard. I don't know where Richard is, and I don't care. My story is done. The revenge is complete. The ledgers are closed. But there is one last, untied thread. I sent a letter to my daughter, I tell Leo, my voice barely a whisper. To Lily? He leans forward slightly. What did it say? The truth. All of it. I didn't ask for her forgiveness. I have no right to it. I didn't ask to see her. I simply offered her the story, the one I just told you. I told her that it was hers by right, should she ever want to claim it. The good and the terrible. I put it in a box and left it on her doorstep. It is her choice whether to open it or not. Has she replied? He asks gently. I shake my head, a slow, small movement. No. Maybe she never will. She has a life, a family, a history that she knows. Why would she want to invite a ghost into it? That is a price I have to pay, a consequence of my own choices. We sit in silence for a long time, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon. Leo finally speaks, his voice full of a new gravity. Did you find it, Abigail? After all this happiness? I consider the question. Happiness. It's such a simple word for such a complicated thing. I think of Lily's smiling face in the photograph. I think of the cold satisfaction of watching Marcus Thorne's world crumble. I think of the profound, cleansing emptiness I felt when Richard left my apartment. No, I say, and the honesty of it feels clean, like the sea air. Not happiness. You can't cauterize a wound that deep and not be left with a scar. The ghost of the girl on Sparrow Lane will always be with me. But that's all she is now. A ghost. A memory. She no longer has any power over me. I stand up and walk to the large glass door that leads to my balcony, sliding it open. The sound of the waves, a steady rhythmic pulse, fills the room. The original contract was built on my silence and my submission. It was breached the moment he laid a hand on me. For decades, I lived in the wreckage of that broken promise. But I don't live there anymore. I look out at the vast, dark ocean, endless and untamable. I have finally written my own unwritten clause, I say, more to myself than to Leo. It's very simple, freedom. I take a deep breath, the salt stinging my lungs, and for the first time in a lifetime, I feel it. Not happiness, something deeper, something more resilient. Peace. And I have signed it myself. My story, the one I kept locked away for so long, is now yours. And it makes me wonder, how many of us are living under the terms of a contract we never agreed to sign? If you've ever felt trapped by someone else's story, let me know in the comments below how you found the strength to start writing your own.